Jacob Voss adjusted his navy blazer as he stepped into the Denver Art Museum's glass atrium. The October evening air was crisp, carrying the scent of approaching winter from the mountains. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light across the crowd of donors and tech executives gathered for his foundation's annual gala. He moved through the crowd with quiet confidence, his practiced smile never reaching his eyes as he nodded to board members and investors who had helped build his nonprofit into a multi-million-dollar operation. The museum's soaring architecture provided a dramatic backdrop for the evening's festivities. Tech moguls rubbed shoulders with oil executives and real estate developers, all united by their shared interest in education reform and the tax benefits that came with charitable giving. Jacob had learned to navigate these waters carefully over the past 5 years, building relationships that serve his foundation's mission while maintaining the low profile that protected his personal interests. Jake! Willa's voice cut through the cocktail chatter as she appeared at his side, her red Valentino dress catching the light as she slipped her arm through his. The dress had cost more than most people made in a month, but she wore it like armor, her confidence restored by the knowledge that she looked stunning. There you are. I was looking everywhere. He smiled at his wife of 2 years, taking in her perfectly styled blonde hair and flawless makeup. Even now, her beauty still caught him off guard sometimes. She'd walked into his life like a force of nature, all confidence and charm and sophisticated elegance that made his simple existence feel suddenly incomplete. Sorry, got pulled into a conversation with the Morrison Foundation Board about the Rural Education Initiative. You could have dressed up more for tonight. Her voice carried just loud enough for nearby guests to hear, the criticism wrapped in honeyed tones that made it sound almost affectionate. Just once, you know. This is important. Jacob glanced down at his simple charcoal suit. It was custom-tailored and cost more than most people made in a month, but it looked ordinary by design. No flashy details, no obvious designer labels, nothing that would draw attention or invite questions about how a nonprofit executive could afford such things. I'm comfortable. That's the problem. Willa's laugh sounded forced, tinkling like broken glass. You run a major foundation. People expect you to look the part. Image matters in this world, Jake. Perception is reality. Before he could respond, a familiar voice cut through the crowd behind them, sharp and disapproving. Well, look who's playing dress-up. Jacob turned to see Dolores Carrington pushing through the crowd, uninvited as usual. His mother-in-law wore a designer gown that probably cost more than she could afford. Her gray hair swept into an elaborate updo that had taken 2 hours at the salon. At 58, she still carried herself like the society queen she'd once been, before her husband's poor business decisions and the 2008 financial crisis had stripped away most of the family wealth. Mother. Willa's tone went flat, embarrassment coloring her cheeks. I told you this was invitation only. Nonsense. I wanted to see what all the fuss was about. Dolores surveyed the room with calculating eyes, taking inventory of the wealthy donors scattered throughout the space like a general assessing a battlefield. Her gaze lingered on the tech billionaires and oil executives, mentally cataloging their net worth and social standing. When her attention returned to Jacob, her expression soured. He doesn't look like the CEO of anything. Jacob felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came whenever Dolores opened her mouth. 2 years of marriage, and she still treated him like hired help who'd somehow conned her daughter into a relationship above his station. The foundation does important work, he said evenly, his voice betraying none of the irritation that simmered beneath the surface. Oh, I'm sure it does. Dolores accepted a champagne glass from a passing waiter, her movements practiced and elegant despite the financial stress that had become her constant companion. Though I have to wonder about the salary. Nonprofits don't exactly make people rich, do they? Not the kind of money that matters in Denver society. Willa shifted beside him, her arm tightening on his with what might have been warning or support. She knew the truth about his wealth, the tech startup he'd sold for $40 million before starting the foundation, the careful way he'd structured his assets to maintain privacy and tax efficiency. But she'd never corrected her mother's assumptions, never defended him against the constant barrage of subtle insults. We do fine, Jacob said, the words carefully neutral. Fine. Dolores savored the word like wine, letting it roll around her tongue with obvious distaste. Such a modest goal. In my day, men had ambition. They wanted to build empires, leave legacies, not just do fine. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sonia Riggs, his foundation COO. She approached with the purposeful stride of someone who had business to conduct, her black pantsuit and sensible shoes a stark contrast to the designer gowns surrounding them. At 34, Sonia had the sharp intelligence and no-nonsense attitude that came from growing up poor and fighting for every opportunity. Jake, sorry to interrupt. The Morrison Group wants to discuss the Education Initiative expansion. They're talking about doubling their commitment. Of course. He turned to Willa, grateful for the escape. I'll be right back. As they walked away, cutting through the crowd toward a cluster of donors near the bar, he could hear Dolores behind them, her voice carrying clearly in the acoustic space. See what I mean? Always working. Never any time for the important things. A real man would delegate, would make time for his wife's social obligations. Sonia waited until they were out of earshot before speaking, her voice low and concerned. How much longer are you going to let her talk to you like that? It doesn't matter what she thinks. Maybe not, but it matters what Willa thinks. And lately, she paused, choosing her words carefully. They'd grown up in the same Denver neighborhood, back when neither of them had $2 to their name. She was one of the few people who knew the full scope of his wealth and understood the complex reasons why he kept it hidden. Lately what? Sonia hesitated, glancing back toward where Willa and Dolores stood whispering, their heads bent close together like conspirators. She's been asking questions about foundation finances, about your compensation structure. Yesterday, she wanted to know if board members ever receive consulting fees. Something cold settled in Jacob's stomach. What did you tell her? Nothing specific. But Jake, some people get ideas when they think they know how much money is in play. And Dolores has been filling Willa's head with poison for months now. He followed her gaze back to where his wife and mother-in-law stood, noting the way they stopped talking whenever other guests approached. The body language was all wrong, guilty, secretive plotting. The Morrison Group, he said, forcing his attention back to business. Let's go talk to them. But even as he smiled and shook hands with potential donors, discussing education reform and rural internet access, part of his mind was cataloging the warning signs he'd been trying to ignore. The way Willa had started questioning his work schedule. The subtle digs about his appearance and lifestyle. The increasing frequency of Dolores's visits. The foundation that had built his public reputation was about to become the weapon they used against him 3 weeks after the gala. Jacob sat in his home office reviewing credit card statements while rain drummed against the windows. The house in Cherry Creek had been Willa's choice, a sprawling modern structure with clean lines and walls of glass that offered views of the city and mountains. He'd bought it because it made her happy, but he'd never felt comfortable in its sterile perfection. The furniture was all white and chrome, beautiful but cold, like living inside a magazine spread. The October storm matched his mood as he spread the Amex statements across his desk. The charges told a story he didn't want to believe. A spa day in Aspen that had cost $3,000. Dinner at Matsuhisa that he'd never attended. Shopping trips to Neiman Marcus and Saks that totaled more than most families spend on groceries in a year. He pulled up the online account and downloaded 6 months of statements, his systematic mind organizing the data into patterns. The progression was clear once he looked for it. Small charges at first, a few hundred here and there, that could be explained away as normal spending. Then bigger ones as confidence grew. Cash advances that Willa had never mentioned, taken from ATMs in parts of town he'd never visited. His phone buzzed against the glass desktop. A text from Willa. Out with Mom. Don't wait up. Discussing some financial stuff? Jacob stared at the message for a long moment, parsing the subtext. In 2 years of marriage, Willa had never shown interest in finances beyond spending money. Dolores handled her own affairs with the secretiveness of someone hiding serious problems. Financial stuff. What kind of financial stuff? He opened his laptop and logged into their joint checking account, scrolling through recent transactions. More patterns emerged. Transfers to accounts he didn't recognize. payments to something called Pinnacle Consulting Services that he'd never authorized. A $5,000 withdrawal from last Tuesday that showed up as miscellaneous. Jacob changed the passwords on all their joint accounts, then sat back in his chair, staring out at the storm. Lightning flickered across the Denver skyline, illuminating the city in stark black and white. His phone rang. Richard Sterling, his personal attorney. "Jake, we need to talk. Can you come in tomorrow morning?" "What's wrong?" "Your wife called my office today. She has some interesting questions about asset protection and marital property rights." The words hit him like ice water. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that make me think someone's been coaching her." "This isn't casual curiosity, Jake. Someone's building a strategy." After the call ended, Jacob sat in the darkening office, rain washing down the windows like tears. Outside, the city went about its business, unaware that his carefully constructed life was beginning to unravel. He opened a new browser window and began researching divorce lawyers in Denver. Not because he wanted one, but because he suspected he was going to need one. The next morning, he drove to his foundation's offices in Lodo through streets still wet from the overnight storm. The converted warehouse building housed 30 employees working on education initiatives across Colorado. It was the kind of space that looked humble from the outside, but hummed with the energy of people who believed in their work. Sonia was waiting in his office with coffee and a stack of grant applications, but her usual cheerful demeanor was strained. "You look like hell," she said, studying his face with concern. "Thanks for the pep talk." He sat behind his desk and opened the first file, trying to lose himself in the familiar routine of reviewing funding requests. "What's on the schedule today?" "Board meeting at 10. Lunch with the State Education Committee about the broadband initiative. And you have a call with the Henderson Trust attorneys at 3. "What about the Henderson Trust?" "The quarterly distribution review. Remember? They're releasing another $2 million for the rural schools program." Jacob nodded absently. The Henderson Trust was one of several large foundations that flowed money through his organization. To anyone looking from the outside, he appeared to be a modestly paid, nonprofit executive managing other people's money. The reality was far more complicated. "Sonia." He closed the file and looked at her directly. "If things go sideways, I want a firewall between me and anyone who's not blood or board certified." She set down her coffee cup, her expression immediately serious. "What kind of sideways?" "The kind where people think they know what I'm worth and decide to take it." Understanding dawned in her eyes. "Willa, I don't know yet, but I want to be ready." Sonia pulled out her phone and started typing notes. "I'll get our legal team on it. Trust restructuring, asset protection, offshore accounts if necessary. We can have everything locked down within a month. Quietly. Always." That afternoon, Jacob met with Richard Sterling in his downtown law office. The space occupied the 42nd floor of a glass tower, offering panoramic views of the Front Range. Sterling had handled his affairs since the startup days, back when Jacob's biggest worry was making payroll for 6 employees working out of a converted garage. "Tell me about your wife's call," Jacob said, settling into a leather chair across from Sterling's desk. "She wanted to know about putting your house in her name. Said you discussed it, but wanted legal advice first." The lie hit him like a physical blow. They'd never discussed any such thing. "She also asked about your foundation salary and whether you have any other income sources. Specifically, she wanted to know if there were any assets she didn't know about." "What did you tell her?" "Nothing. Attorney-client privilege." "But Jake, she's fishing. Someone's been feeding her ideas about what you might be worth and how to get access to it." Sterling opened a file on his desk. "I did some checking after a call. Your mother-in-law has been making inquiries, too. She contacted a private investigator last week, asking about asset searches and financial disclosure requirements in divorce proceedings." Jacob felt the trap closing around him, carefully constructed over months of subtle manipulation and growing resentment. "How long do we have?" "If they're moving toward divorce, probably a few weeks before they file. Colorado has a 90-day waiting period, so they'll want to get the process started while building their case for a larger settlement. And if they're planning something more aggressive." Sterling's expression darkened. "Then we need to move faster than they do." The call came on a Tuesday morning while Jacob sat in his office reviewing quarterly reports. The foundation was having its best year ever, with major grants from tech companies and private donors funding new programs across the state. On paper, it looked like the perfect success story. Richard Sterling's voice was tight with concern when Jacob answered. "Your wife contacted my office again yesterday." Jacob set down his pen, giving the conversation his full attention. "About what?" "She wants to schedule a meeting. Says you've been discussing restructuring some assets, and she wants to make sure everything is handled properly." Another lie. Jacob felt his jaw clench as the deception deepened. She also asked specific questions about the foundation's compensation structure and whether board members receive consulting fees or equity stakes. She's building a case. It gets worse. "I had lunch with Tom Morrison from the DA's office yesterday. Someone's been asking questions about you around town. Financial background checks, employment verification, the works. They're trying to establish your real net worth." After the call ended, Jacob sat staring out his office window at the Denver skyline. The mountains were visible in the distance, snow-capped peaks that had stood for millions of years while human ambitions played out in their shadow. His phone rang again. This time it was a number he didn't recognize. "Mr. Voss? This is Detective Angela Morrison with Denver PD Financial Crimes. We'd like to talk to you about some irregularities with your accounts." Jacob's blood went cold. "What kind of irregularities?" "Someone's been making unauthorized inquiries about your assets. Trying to get information from banks, credit agencies, investment firms. We think someone might be planning to target you for identity theft or financial fraud." The detective arranged to meet him the next day. After hanging up, Jacob called Sonia and asked her to come to his office immediately. "We need to accelerate the timeline," he said when she arrived. "How fast can we implement the asset protection protocols?" "How fast do you need them?" "Yesterday." Sonia opened her laptop and pulled up the financial restructuring plans they'd been developing. "If we cut some corners and work around the clock, maybe 2 weeks. But it's going to require some creative legal work. Do it, whatever it costs." That evening, Jacob came home to find Willa and Dolores in the kitchen, sharing a bottle of expensive Bordeaux and whispering like conspirators. They stopped talking when he walked in, their conversation dying with suspicious abruptness. "How was work, honey?" Willa's voice was too bright, too cheerful, like an actress playing a role she hadn't quite mastered. "Fine." He opened the refrigerator and pulled out a beer, studying their faces in the reflection of the stainless steel door. Both women looked guilty, caught in the middle of something they didn't want him to know about. "What are you two plotting?" "Plotting?" Dolores laughed, but it sounded forced brittle. "We're just talking about Willa's future. Her financial security." "What about her financial security?" "Well, she should have some independence, don't you think?" Dolores's voice carried a challenge, testing his reaction. A woman needs to protect herself. You never know what might happen to a marriage these days. Jacob took a long pull from his beer and studied his mother-in-law over the bottle. "Like what?" "Like men who aren't what they seem." Dolores met his gaze directly, her eyes hard with calculation. "Men who promise security but can't deliver. Men who live above their means and leave their wives to deal with the consequences." "Mother." Willa's voice held a warning, but her eyes never left Jacob's face. "I'm just saying, sweetheart, you should have the house in your name. Men with nothing to hide never resist that kind of arrangement. It's only fair, considering you gave up your career to support his work." Jacob felt the trap closing around him with mechanical precision. If he agreed, he'd be handing over the biggest asset they owned jointly. If he refused, he'd look guilty of hiding something more substantial. "That's an interesting idea," he said carefully. "Why don't we talk to our lawyer about it?" "Already did," Willis said quickly, too quickly. I called and asked some general questions. He said it would be easy to arrange." Another lie. Sterling would have told him immediately if Willa had called about transferring the house. "Great," Jacob said, his voice pleasant but steel running underneath it. "Let's set up a meeting with him. All 3 of us together." Dolores's smile faltered slightly. "Oh, that's not necessary. This is between you and Willa. I'm just offering motherly advice." "I insist." Jacob's tone brooked no argument. "Family decisions should involve the whole family. I want everyone to be completely comfortable with whatever we decide." He left from the kitchen and went upstairs to his office, closing the door behind him. Through the wood, he could hear their voices rising in urgent whispers, though he couldn't make out the specific words. The tone was clear enough: panic, frustration, the sound of a plan falling apart. Jacob opened his laptop and began composing an email to Sterling. Then he stopped and picked up his phone instead. Some conversations were too important to leave a digital trail. "Richard, it's Jake. They're moving faster than we thought. How quickly can you get those asset protections in place? If we work nights and weekends, maybe 10 days. Do it. And Richard, I think we're going to need criminal defense attorneys too. Jake, what the hell is going on over there?" Jacob looked out his office window at the lights of Denver spread below like a circuit board. Somewhere out there, people were planning to take everything he'd built. They thought he was weak, naive, an easy mark who'd been blinded by love. They were about to learn otherwise. "War," he said quietly. "We're going to war." 2 weeks later, Willa announced over breakfast that she wanted to try a new restaurant in Lodo. The timing wasn't coincidental. Jacob had just finished restructuring his assets with Sterling's help, and somehow she seemed to know their legal maneuvering was complete. "It's supposed to be amazing," Willis said, buttering her toast with deliberate casualness. "Osteria locale. Very exclusive, very sophisticated. I made reservations for Friday night." "Sounds good. I invited Mother to join us. I hope that's okay." She didn't meet his eyes as she spoke, focusing intently on her breakfast, as if the perfect distribution of jam required her complete attention. Jacob spread jam on his own toast and considered his options. He could refuse, but that would tip his hand and confirm their suspicions that something had changed. Better to let them play their game and see what they were really after. "Of course, it'll be nice to have a family dinner." The words tasted bitter in his mouth. Family. As if the woman sitting across from him hadn't spent the last month plotting to rob him blind. Friday evening, Jacob dressed with deliberate care. He chose a simple black suit and white shirt, no tie. The kind of outfit that could belong to a middle manager or a millionaire, depending on who was looking and what they expected to see. He met Willa and Dolores at the restaurant, arriving precisely on time to find them already waiting on the sidewalk. Both women were dressed to impress. Willa in a black cocktail dress that emphasized her figure, Dolores in a navy suit that probably represented a significant portion of her monthly budget. Osteria Locale occupied a converted warehouse in Lodo, its brick exterior giving way to an interior of exposed beams and industrial fixtures softened by warm lighting and carefully chosen art. It was the kind of place that didn't advertise, where reservations were harder to get than Broncos season tickets, and the wine list started at $50 a bottle. "Are you sure you can afford this place?" Dolores asked as they approached the entrance, her voice pitched to carry to other diners walking past. "It looks very expensive." Jacob didn't answer immediately. He opened the door and let them walk in first, following behind as they entered the restaurant's warm ambience. The hostess looked up from her podium and smiled with genuine pleasure. "Welcome back, Mr. Voss. Your usual table." The words hung in the air like smoke signals, carrying implications that rippled through the small group. Jacob watched Willa's face go pale, saw Dolores's mouth drop open in surprise and confusion. "That would be perfect, Maria. Thank you." They were led through the main dining room, past tables filled with Denver's business elite and cultural influencers, to a corner booth that offered privacy and a clear view of the open kitchen. Jacob had sat here dozens of times over the past 3 years, usually alone or with business associates who valued discretion over flash. "I don't understand," Willis said once they were seated, her voice tight with confusion. "How do they know you here? I eat here sometimes, but this place is—" She gestured around at the exposed brick walls, the open kitchen where chefs worked over roaring flames, the sommelier consulting with customers over $1,000 bottles of wine. "It's expensive, really expensive. Is it?" The server appeared before she could answer, a young man with a practiced professionalism that came from working in Denver's finest establishments. "Good evening, Mr. Voss. Can I start you with your usual bourbon? The Pappy Van Winkle, 15-year. Please." Dolores leaned forward, her composure cracking as her carefully constructed assumptions crumbled in real time. "Excuse me, But how long has he been coming here? The server looked confused by the question, glancing between the three diners as if trying to understand the family dynamics at play. Mr. Voss has been one of our most valued regular guests since we opened. 3 years now, I believe. That's impossible, Dolores said, her voice rising slightly. He can't afford. Mother. Willa's voice was sharp with embarrassment. Don't. But Dolores was past caring about subtlety. The careful plan she and Willa had constructed over months of plotting was crumbling in real time, and she was watching years of scheming collapse. We know exactly what he makes, she continued, her voice carrying to nearby tables. Nonprofit salaries are public record. There's no way he can afford a place like this on what he earns. Actually, Jacob interrupted, his voice quiet but carrying clearly in the acoustic space. They're not. He pulled out his phone and showed them a document he'd prepared for this moment. His foundation's tax filings, with his compensation clearly listed in black and white. Willa stared at the numbers, her face cycling through confusion, realization, and something that might have been fear. This says you made almost $2 million last year. Compensation isn't just salary. There are performance bonuses based on fundraising targets, consulting fees for strategic planning, speaking engagements at conferences. The foundation does well, so I do well. It was true as far as it went. What the document didn't show was the wealth he'd accumulated before starting the foundation, or the complex web of trusts and investments that generated income far beyond his official compensation. But you always said, Willa trailed off, unable to finish the accusation without admitting how closely she'd been monitoring his finances. I said we do fine. We do. The server returned with his bourbon, a glass of amber liquid that cost more than most people spend on groceries in a week. Jacob tasted it slowly, savoring both the whiskey and the expressions on his companions' faces. The dinner continued in tense silence, punctuated by stilted attempts at conversation. Dolores picked at her $40 salmon while shooting furious glances at Jacob. Willa drank too much wine and asked increasingly pointed questions about his finances, each query revealing more about what she thought she knew. If you have money, why do you live like you don't? The wine had loosened her tongue, making her bolder than wisdom would suggest. Jacob cut into his steak with deliberate precision, each movement controlled and purposeful. Because money isn't a personality. That's easy to say when you have it. Is it? He looked at her directly, studying the woman he'd thought he loved. You married me thinking I was poor. What does that say about your motivations? I married you because I loved you. Did you? The question hung between them like a blade. Willa's eyes filled with tears, but Jacob felt nothing. The woman sitting across from him had been planning to rob him blind while he slept beside her every night. Any love he'd felt had died the moment he discovered her betrayal. I think, he said quietly, each word chosen with surgical precision, that you married me thinking I was someone you could control. Someone grateful enough for your attention that I'd never question your loyalty or your motives. That's not true, isn't it? Jacob pulled out his phone again. This time he showed them bank statements, their joint accounts, with every suspicious transaction highlighted in yellow. $17,000 in unauthorized withdrawals over the last 3 months. Cash advances on credit cards I never approved. Transfers to accounts I don't recognize. Willa's face went white as the evidence of her deception spread across the table like a tarot reading. I can explain. I'm sure you can. Just like you can explain why you asked our lawyer about putting the house in your name, or why you've been meeting with Nash Rutledge twice a week at the Marriott downtown. Dolores dropped her fork, the silver clattering against china with a sound that rang across their corner of the restaurant. You've been following me. Willa's voice was barely a whisper. I've been protecting myself. You thought I was a man you could outplay. That was your first mistake. Jacob stood and pulled out his wallet, extracting bills with the same careful precision he applied to everything else in his life. He left $300 on the table, enough to cover their meals, and a generous tip that would ensure the staff remembered this evening for all the right reasons. The second mistake was underestimating how much I know about you both. The third was thinking I'd let you get away with it. He walked away without looking back, leaving them to figure out how to pay for a dinner they couldn't afford on a credit card they'd already maxed out with unauthorized purchases. Outside, the October evening was crisp and clear, Denver's skyline glittering against the mountains. Jacob took a deep breath of cold air and smiled for the first time in weeks. The war had begun. The next morning, Jacob sat in Sterling's office reviewing the final asset protection documents. The law firm occupied an entire floor of a downtown high-rise, its conference rooms offering panoramic views of the Front Range. Everything was in place now, trusts buried within trusts, offshore accounts in jurisdictions that didn't recognize American court orders, corporate structures so complex that even forensic accountants would need months to unravel them. If they come after you legally, what will they find? Sterling asked, spreading documents across his polished mahogany desk. A nonprofit executive with a modest salary who doesn't own the house he lives in. And the real assets? Untouchable, protected by attorney-client privilege, foreign banking laws, and about 12 different legal entities that exist only on paper in 3 different countries. Sterling made a note on his legal pad with a gold pen that probably cost more than most people's car payments. What about evidence of their fraud? Jacob opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder bound with red ribbon. Inside were bank records showing unauthorized transfers, email printouts between Willa and Nash planning their approach, credit reports that prove they'd been taking cash advances on cards he didn't know existed. This is criminal-level stuff, Jake. Identity theft, fraud, conspiracy. We're talking serious prison time if the DA decides to prosecute. I know. Through Sonia's careful investigation and Sterling's legal connections, they'd uncovered the full scope of the conspiracy. Nash Rutledge wasn't just Willa's personal trainer and secret lover. He was drowning in gambling debts that totaled over $200,000 and saw her as his ticket out of financial ruin. Dolores had been the mastermind, convinced that Jacob was hiding significant wealth and that they could take it through a carefully orchestrated divorce. The beautiful thing, Jacob said, studying the documents spread before him, is that Colorado law is very clear about spousal support. If someone commits fraud or acts in bad faith during the marriage, they forfeit their right to alimony. You're really going to destroy them. Jacob thought about the 2 years he'd spent loving a woman who was planning to rob him. The nights he'd lain awake wondering if he was paranoid, if he was imagining threats that didn't exist. The slow realization that his wife and her mother saw him as nothing more than a walking ATM with a wedding ring. They destroyed themselves. I'm just making sure everyone knows it. That afternoon, he called Detective Morrison from his office. The foundation was quiet around him, his employees going about their important work while he prepared to wage war on the people who'd betrayed him. We're ready to move forward with the fraud investigation, he said. You have evidence. More than enough. Wire transfers, forged signatures, conspiracy charges that will stick. The DA is going to love this case. When do you want us to move? Give me 48 hours to coordinate with my attorney. Then take them down. Jacob hung up the phone and looked out at the Denver skyline, the mountains standing eternal in the distance. In 2 days, Willa and Dolores would wake up to a world that had changed forever. They'd thought they were hunting him, but he'd been hunting them. The trap was set. Now all he had to do was spring it. Jacob chose Osteria Locale for the final confrontation. It seemed fitting the scene of their first real battle would also be the scene of their last. He wanted them to understand, in the place where their deception had first been exposed, just how completely they had underestimated him, that he arrived 30 minutes early and took his usual corner booth, spreading documents across the table like a general preparing for battle. The restaurant was quiet in the late afternoon, empty except for staff preparing for the evening service. Chef Luis Ortega emerged from the kitchen to greet him personally. This is unusual for you, Jacob. Afternoon meetings? This one's special. Luis studied his face with the sharp eyes of someone who'd built a successful business by reading people. Do you need anything particular tonight? Privacy, and maybe a good bottle of wine when it's over. His guests arrived precisely on time. Sterling came first, carrying his briefcase full of legal documents and wearing the serious expression of an attorney about to destroy someone's life. Detective Morrison followed, dressed in civilian clothes, but carrying herself with the unmistakable authority of law enforcement. Sonia arrived last, her laptop bag containing financial evidence that would make everything else academic. When Willa and Dolores walked through the door, they looked confident despite everything that had happened at their last dinner. Dolores wore her best designer suit, probably the last expensive thing she'd be able to afford for a long time. Willa had chosen a black dress that made her look like she was attending a funeral. How appropriate, Jacob thought as he watched them approach the table. This is quite a crowd, Dolores said as she slid into the booth, her voice carrying forced cheer. Are we celebrating something? In a way. Jacob gestured to his companions with theatrical formality. I think you know Richard Sterling, my attorney. This is Detective Angela Morrison from Denver PD Financial Crimes. And, of course, you know Sonia. The color drained from Willa's face as the implications hit her. Jake, what's going on? You want to talk things through. So let's talk. Jacob opened the folder in front of him and spread documents across the table, like he was dealing cards in the world's most expensive poker game. Bank statements, email printouts, photographs of Willa and Nash entering hotel rooms, credit reports showing accounts opened without authorization. 17 unauthorized withdrawals from our joint account, totaling $23,000. 3 credit cards opened in my name without my knowledge or consent. 1 forged signature on a loan application that constitutes a federal crime. I never. Willa started, but her voice died as Detective Morrison leaned forward. You did. Morrison's voice carried the flat authority of someone who'd seen every scam and con game in the book. We have video surveillance from First National Bank. You signed Jacob Voss's name to a credit application on March 15th at 2:30 in the afternoon. Dolores leaned forward, her composure cracking, but her defiance still intact. You're bluffing. You can't prove anything. Jacob smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. Detective, would you like to show them the evidence? Morrison opened her own folder and pulled out a stack of photographs that documented the conspiracy in excruciating detail. Willa and Nash at the Marriott, caught by hotel security cameras. Dolores meeting with a private investigator who specialized in asset discovery, photographed through a telephoto lens. Nash depositing checks at 3 different banks, the transactions captured by ATM cameras. The conspiracy charges alone will put you away for 5 years, Morrison said, her voice matter of fact. Add in the fraud, forgery, and identity theft, and we're looking at serious federal prison time. Willa started crying, mascara running down her cheeks in black streams. Jake, please. I just wanted more. His voice was ice, each word precisely enunciated. You wanted more. I know. We can work this out, Dolores said desperately, her aristocratic facade finally crumbling. We don't need to involve the police. This is a family matter. Actually, we do. Sterling pulled out a subpoena and slid it across the table like he was serving dinner. You're both being called to testify in divorce proceedings. Perjury charges will be filed if you lie under oath. And at this point, we have enough evidence to contradict almost anything you might say. This is insane, Dolores snapped, her composure finally breaking completely. He's a nobody, a nonprofit executive who can barely afford to eat at places like this, who drives a 10-year-old Honda and wears the same 3 suits to every social event. Who can barely afford what? Jacob's voice cut through her protests like a blade. This restaurant that I've been a silent partner in since it opened? The house you want Willa to own, which is actually held in a trust one control. The foundation that you think pays me a modest salary? He pulled out his phone and showed them a document that made Dolores gasp audibly. Net worth, $47 million. All of it protected, all of it documented, all of it legally mine. The next morning, Jacob filed for divorce in Denver District Court. Sterling had prepared the paperwork weeks ago, and under Colorado law, Willa's documented fraud made her ineligible for spousal support. The petition included a request for attorneys' fees and damages related to the unauthorized financial transactions. The criminal investigation moved with the swift efficiency of a case that prosecutors love: clear evidence, obvious motives, and defendants who'd left a paper trail that even first-year law students could follow. Nash was arrested at his apartment, where police found evidence of the gambling debts that had motivated his partnership with Willa. His cooperation with investigators was immediate and complete. Dolores was charged with conspiracy, fraud, and conspiracy to commit identity theft. Her role as the mastermind made her the most culpable, and her refusal to cooperate made her the prosecutor's primary target. She was looking at federal prison time and financial ruin. Willa avoided the most serious criminal charges, but only barely. Her cooperation with investigators and obvious manipulation by her mother earned her some leniency from prosecutors. She would serve 18 months of probation and 500 hours of community service, but her reputation in Denver society was destroyed beyond repair. 2 weeks after the arrests made headlines in the Denver Post. She called Jacob. Her voice was small, broken, barely recognizable as the confident woman he'd married. "Can we meet? I need to explain. Please." They met at a coffee shop in Cherry Creek, neutral ground where neither of them had history or shared memories. The place was busy with the lunch crowd, providing cover for a conversation that could have been overheard by reporters or social media influencers eager to document the fall of Denver's most talked-about marriage. Willa looked like she'd aged 10 years in 2 weeks. Her designer clothes had been replaced by simple jeans and a sweater. Her hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and she wore no makeup to hide the effects of stress and sleepless nights. "I never wanted it to go this far," she said, staring into her coffee cup as if it contained answers to questions she was afraid to ask. "What did you want?" "I wanted you to care more. About appearances, about status, about the things that matter to people in our social circle." "You mean the things that matter to you?" She nodded slowly, finally meeting his eyes. "I married you thinking you'd change. That success would make you different, more like the men I grew up around. More like the men your mother approved of. Maybe." Her voice was barely audible above the coffee shop's ambient noise. "I just wanted more than what we had." Jacob studied the woman he'd once loved, seeing clearly for the first time the insecurity and entitlement that had driven her actions. Even now, sitting across from the wreckage of her life, she couldn't take full responsibility. Everything was someone else's fault: her mother's influence, Nash's pressure, society's expectations. "Then you should have married someone with less honor and more ego." He left her sitting at the table and walked away, stepping into the Denver afternoon with the clean feeling of a man who'd finally closed a chapter of his life that had been written in invisible ink. This time, he knew it was forever. 3 months later, Jacob sat in his usual booth at Osteria Locale, reading the Denver Business Journal's cover story about his foundation's latest initiatives. The restaurant was busier than ever. Word had gotten out about the dinner that ended a dynasty, and Denver's social set couldn't resist the drama of dining where financial warfare had been waged. Chef Luis Ortega emerged from the kitchen and slid into the booth across from him, wiping his hands on his apron. "Business is good," Luis said with satisfaction. "Bookings are up 30% since the story broke. People want to eat where Jacob Voss brought down his cheating wife. I'm glad something positive came out of it. You did the right thing, you know. People like that, they never stop taking. They just get greedier until someone stops them." Jacob nodded, thinking of all the other men who might not have been as prepared or as ruthless when faced with similar betrayal. The next day, he established a scholarship fund at the University of Colorado Denver campus. The Dolores Carrington Memorial Scholarship for first-generation college students with no family financial support would provide full tuition and living expenses for 10 students each year. The irony appealed to him on multiple levels. His former mother-in-law's name would forever be associated with helping the kind of people she'd always looked down on. When reporters asked about the scholarship at the announcement ceremony, he simply said, "Everyone deserves a chance to build something meaningful." The scholarship would be funded by the money he'd recovered from Willa's fraudulent transactions, plus interest and penalties. Justice served cold. With compound interest. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, Jacob returned to Osteria Locale for a quiet dinner alone. The autumn evening was crisp, reminiscent of the night when his marriage had first begun to unravel at the Foundation Gala. But now the seasonal change felt like renewal rather than endings. The hostess greeted him with her usual smile and genuine warmth. "Welcome back, Mr. Voss. Your usual table. Please." He was led to the corner booth that had become his regular spot, past tables filled with Denver's business elite and cultural influencers. The restaurant hummed with conversation and the sounds of a busy kitchen, but his corner remained an island of peace in the controlled chaos. Jacob ordered his usual the ribeye, medium rare, with a glass of Merlot that cost more than most people spent on dinner for four, and opened his laptop. On the screen was a proposal for a new education initiative, one that would bring high-speed internet and technology resources to underserved schools across rural Colorado. He was building again. Not just wealth this time, but legacy. Something that would matter long after he was gone. Something that would help kids who reminded him of his younger self, smart, ambitious, but lacking the resources to turn potential into reality. A server approached with his wine, the same young man who'd been working here since the restaurant opened. "Anything else tonight, Mr. Voss?" "No, thank you. This is perfect." He raised his glass in a silent toast to the empty chairs around his table. To the people who'd thought they could take what wasn't theirs, who'd mistaken his humility for weakness and his love for blindness. To the lesson he'd learned about the difference between appearing successful and actually being successful. The table had been his all along. They'd just been too blind to see it. Jacob smiled and returned to his laptop, planning a future built on solid ground instead of the shifting sands of other people's greed and envy. Outside, Denver glittered in the darkness, full of possibilities for those wise enough to earn them honestly and strong enough to protect them when necessary. Eye in the distance. The mountain stood eternal against the star-filled sky, indifferent to human ambition, but somehow approving of human perseverance. Jacob had learned to be like those mountains, patient, enduring, and ultimately immovable when the storms came. He took another sip of wine and continued working, building something that would last.